Hey there, welcome to Skilling Up with ATD New Mexico. I'm Kelly Tinnen, the Vice President of Social Media and Communications. And I am excited to bring you this special program where we actually are going to be interviewing Pamela Fuller with FranklinCovey. So Pamela, for more than 15 years, has worked in both the public and private sector supporting clients and solving complex problems. She currently serves as FranklinCovey's thought leader on inclusion and bias, as well as a global client partner responsible for supporting some of the organization's most strategic accounts. She has designed programs that have made an impact on hundreds of thousands of participants, to include FranklinCovey's newest offering, Unconscious Bias, Understanding Bias to Unleash Potential. And that's what we're talking about today. Before we move on to our programming, I want to give a shout out to ATD New Mexico member Justin Bogus, client partner with FranklinCovey. He was a great help in organizing this interview today. So I hope you enjoy. Pamela? Good morning.
Kelly, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Good morning, Justin. So I am here with Pamela Fuller with FranklinCovey, and she is the author of this awesome book, Leader's Guide to Unconscious Bias. So Pamela, how did this book come to fruition?
Yeah, it's a great question. So FranklinCovey, I'm with FranklinCovey. I'm our thought leader on inclusion and bias. And FranklinCovey is focused on behavior change and performance improvement. And we do that through learning and development offerings. And we have a learning and development solution around unconscious bias. And that really came about because as we think about leadership and all of the tenets of good leadership and what it takes to be a good leader, many leaders fancy themselves great leaders, and fewer leaders really think about whether they're inclusive leaders. And the reality is that if you're not an inclusive leader, then your leadership can't be great, because someone intentionally or unintentionally, or some group of people, is being left out of your leadership. So as a world leader in leadership development, it was important for us to have a voice in the space of inclusion. And as we design the solution, there are limitations to sort of what you can put in a learning experience. And we just did so much more sort of research and had additional thoughts and ideas that we wanted to share. And I think a book gives you the opportunity to also expand your reach and audience. And so everything that we put into our learning solution, and also the additional things that got left in the cutting room floor, got to go into this book. And so we decided that we would put a book together with all of our perspective and insight around what it is to be an inclusive leader.
That's awesome. One thing I liked about the book is when reading through it, I really felt and got the sense for that bias shouldn't be a stigma, that we should all be comfortable in some regard recognizing that we have bias, and that's really kind of the first step in changing your perspective, is recognizing, hey, I might be looking at this through a different set of glasses. Let me take a step back. Would you say that's kind of on point?
Gotten a lot of feedback that the approach is disarming, that you sort of pick up the book and you're ready to, you might have your arms crossed and you're sort of ready to read about all the ways that you're a terrible person. And that is certainly not our approach, right? If I were to say I don't have bias, what I'm saying is my brain doesn't function properly, right? Cognitive bias is a way in which we navigate the world. It helps us understand all of the information coming our way and actively process the things that are important. And if we didn't have these sort of shortcuts in our brain, we'd all still be in bed, right? We couldn't speak in complete sentences. We couldn't make important decisions. We couldn't make simple decisions about what to wear each day. So it is important to sort of set this foundation that bias is a natural part of the human condition. And our purpose is not to vilify anybody for the biases that they hold, but instead to push them to think about, what is the impact of that bias? How do I add this level of sort of complexity and nuance to my thinking by asking questions about my own lens and how that could be impacting the decisions that I make and the ways in which I interact with other people?
Yeah. I mean, for me, even it caused me, after reading the book, to kind of take a step back in the way that I look at things. For instance, like a concrete example is we were, I'm part of a small nonprofit group here in New Mexico, and we were looking at bringing on somebody to help us with a certain aspect of the work for that group. And I kind of brushed off the idea of an individual because I had some kind of preconceived notions about this individual's performance. And I caught myself, and I felt like I should have really taken a step back and say, okay, well, just because this individual performs a certain way in this aspect, like, am I really looking at the whole picture? So I felt it was really thought-provoking for me. So yeah, I really enjoyed that of the book. And I really enjoyed how disarming it was in terms of, hey, we all have this, but let's think about it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I mean, I think that the reality is when we recognize bias in ourselves, it is not always like our finest hour, right? It's not always our proudest moment.
Right.
And I think that's a really important part of this conversation, is that we have to be sort of vulnerable to the realities of the biases that we hold, and ask ourselves the kinds of questions that you asked yourself in that circumstance.
Yeah. It's not always, well, who wants to look in the mirror and say, oh, like, you made a mistake? But yeah. And that leads me to the self-awareness piece. There's a lot of talk about self-awareness in the book. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Definitely. So I mean, our ability to identify the biases that we hold is not a matter of like thinking really hard and coming up with a list, right? It is really exercising this muscle of self-awareness. The journalist Chris Hayes talks about the intellectual pursuit of introspection, right? It is like that it is a heavy and difficult thing to look inside of yourself. And I think self-awareness is like emotional intelligence. It's one of those things that everyone like says they have, and then you engage with them and you're like, I don't know that you have as much of that as you think, right? Like we there's always work to do in terms of building our emotional intelligence, our empathy, our self-awareness. And so in the book, we talk about some strategies for how you can really dig around in your own self, right? And start to look at things a little bit differently. So we talk about the relationship between our identities and the biases that we hold. And I do have 2 boys and a husband who is sometimes like a third boy. And we're in my house, they're obsessed with superheroes. We're obsessed with superheroes. And every superhero has like an origin story. And so we talk in the book about our biases have origin stories. There's a reason that I see something in a certain way, whether it is an experience I had or a value or belief I hold or something I was raised with, right? Something that someone I admire taught me, or some behavior that a mentor exhibited that I really believe is important. And so we take all of that and we lay that over other people and circumstances. And we say, this is good and this is bad, or this is desired and this is undesired, or I trust this and I don't trust that. And so digging around sort of in your own identity to identify what those things are is a really powerful sort of first step to building self-awareness. We also talk about what is happening in the brain that makes us more susceptible to biased thinking, and the reality that when you're overwhelmed, when you have high emotion about a circumstance, or when you feel under duress and you need to act quickly, you're more likely to make biased decisions, and really decisions that might be limited, right? That they don't sort of take into account the whole picture, but your brain is feeling pressure, and so makes like snap judgments and quick decisions. And so one of the strategies we talk about to sort of create some space between stimulus and response in those circumstances is mindfulness. And I think mindfulness is often dismissed as like, I can't meditate for 2 hours a day. and I certainly can't meditate for 2 hours a day. My husband and I were talking about meditation. Every time I try to meditate for more than like 15 minutes, I fall asleep. And my colleague is actually a meditation teacher. And he said, well, that's good. It's like, it's actually your brain being able to sort of succumb to what it needs. And so meditation is one aspect of mindfulness, but mindfulness can be as brief as a meditation on the breath, Or it could be something more concrete for those of us who feel like meditation is too sort of wishy-washy, right? It could be spending the last 30 minutes of your day pulling up your Outlook, right, your calendar, and reflecting on each of the meetings you had and how you responded to those people, or what decisions were made throughout the day, and thinking about, what biases were at play in that decision or in that circumstance, and sort of building some awareness around your lens in that way.
And I liked the concept in the book about building an environment where people can thrive no matter what. Instead of, are you going to fit into this hole? How can we kind of open the door, so to speak, to bring you and your talents in, rather than trying to fit square pegs in a round hole, so to speak?
Yeah, I think this word fit is a bit of a 4-letter word in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Because it carries so much baggage. Like, I could say, I don't think that Justin is a good fit for this thing. And I could mean 100 different things with that statement, right? And so it's really important when we hear the word fit, when we find ourselves using the word fit, to ask some questions about what does that mean? So, like, why isn't Justin a fit for that thing? And what have you seen from Justin that shows that he wouldn't be a fit for that thing? And what are your expectations for that thing? And what of those sort of qualities or qualifications does Justin lack? Like, we have to really get specific about what we mean. And I think that there is this sense that, organizations are really good at growing people in their own image, right? The military is the best example of this. You go to boot camp and they tear you down and rebuild you in the image of the Army, or the image of a Marine, or the image of the Navy, right? Yeah. But I think all organizations do that, right? They have organizational norms around whether we are risk averse or risk seeking, whether we tout innovation or status quo, whether we are top down in our approach or more agile in terms of sort of distributed decisions, right? And so organizations use this word fit, and quite often it results in like conformity or some real specifics around what someone needs to be in leadership. And as an employee, you of course see that, right? Like, the writing is on the wall about how you need to act. And so you try to make yourself fit into whatever those spoken or unspoken norms and expectations are. And there's a weight to that, right? There's an emotional toll to having to sort of make yourself different or hide some parts of yourself, or even the signaling, right? When you look at diversity in particular, if people who look like you or love like you or are of your gender, right, are not in leadership positions, it feels like this indication that you won't quite fit. And so instead, we need to think about how can we build organizations that are sort of welcoming of authenticity and really allow people to bring their whole selves to work. I think it is like self-awareness. It's like overstated, underdone, that people say that that's the environment they have. And then you get there and you sort of quickly see that that's not the case. Like, they don't actually want you to bring up new ideas at meetings, or they don't actually want you to bring up any ideas. They want you to just take your marching orders and execute, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that idea of culture fit, and that question of how are we creating a space where people can bring their full authentic selves, is a really important one to ask.
And that's really powerful, I think, to me, because I've been in that situation. I've been in those situations where I equate it to feeling like you're the girl who showed up to the party in the red dress when everyone is wearing something different, and you're like, oh, I didn't get the memo. That's what I equate that to, and it's not a good feeling.
Like, in many ways, those expectations silence you, right? So you sort of show up and you think, this is what we're doing here. Like, we're innovative. We're about pushing against the status quo. And you're sort of early in your career or early in your time at a place, disavowed of that belief by a comment or a behavior or something that you witness. And then you like integrate that into your own professional decisions and decide, okay, I won't do that anymore. Right. So I think those norms can be really stifling for people.
It can be. And is it hard do you think it's hard once that's been ingrained in you in some regard that it's hard to rewire that or unravel that, so to speak?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I mean, this is a question I get quite a bit when I talk with leaders about, what if I've like inherited an employee who has been on the receiving end of negative bias like a lot in their career, and how do I undo, like they might have 5 years left in their career before retirement, and how do I sort of undo all of the negative that they've experienced? Because at this point they're a poor performer, but they probably weren't a poor performer in their third year, right? But like 10 years in of feeling like you've been marginalized or diminished in some way, like why would you perform wonderfully? Why would you bring anything more than minimal effort to the role?
Right.
And I think it really takes a lot of patience. Like it's not something that is 10 years ingrained is not going to be undone with one conversation.
Right.
And I think that leaders struggle with that. They're like, well, we had to sit down and I told them that I really care about their success and that I'm here for them, and they're still not performing well. And it's like, right. I mean, it's 10 years. And I'm sure you're not the first person to have told them that.
Right.
And they're really cynical about it. They're waiting to see if your behavior actually reflects that intent. And so I think for leaders, it's important to recognize that it will take some time to unravel what took some time to do.
Yeah.
And I think for individuals, the question is that I always have is, if you're unable to perform in this place, like, is it the right place for you? Because at some point, as we think about coping with bias and negative biases, there is a place, there is an organizational culture that would not feel so inhibiting, right? Would not feel so stifling. And I think when we are on the receiving end of negative bias, we start to see ourselves through this deficit lens, and we feel like we can't seek out other opportunity, or like no one would want to hire me because I'm actually not any good at anything, or right? Like you start to onboard this really negative narrative around your own possibilities and capability. And I think it's really important to build sort of a board of directors, right? Like whether that is friends or your partner in life or a coach or mentor, right? Like whatever it is that you have access to help sort of rewrite that negative narrative so you can seek other opportunity or show up differently to unravel some of that harm that's been done.
What did you guys referred to it in the book, or you referred to it in the book as neuroplasticity, right?
Yeah, so it is, neuroplasticity is our brain's ability to rewire, right? To learn a new habit and sort of a new neural pathway to how we look at a circumstance or situation.
Yeah. You also talk about in the book, or maybe I correlated this to some of the things that I was reading, psychological safety, and really kind of building an environment where people can be authentic and feel comfortable. And there was a story in the book, or Mark's story, I think, about using the Uber driver's name. And I don't know if you recall that story or not, but the Uber driver was like, wow, like in 7 months or whatever it is that I've been here, nobody's used my name. And so I guess in terms of psychological safety, that's an aspect of promoting or being an inclusive leader.
Certainly. I mean, one of the models in the book is this sort of performance model, right? Mm-hmm. That our goal is to be in the high performance zone where people feel respected, included, and valued, and able to contribute their best. And in this sort of speedometer type model, the other two zones are called the limiting zone and the damaging zone. And in the damaging zone is where people feel slighted, harassed, and abused. And one example of slighting or really microaggression is the way that, I mean, at least I think in every country, the nationalities are different. But in the US, for example, when someone has an ethnic name, those names are often dismissed, right? It's like, oh, that's too hard. My tongue can't do that roly thing to say your name, or, I don't know how to pronounce that. Can I just call you Fred? Like, or they just don't use your name at all, or they consistently forget your name, right? And I think names are such a critical part of our identity, right? I mean, my name is Pamela and I own that, right? And it's how I identify. And it's important to me that people use my name and remember my name. Mindy Kaling is a comedian, and in her first book, she says people who say they're bad with names are full of it. She's like, because they'll remember names that are important to them, no matter how complicated those names might be, right? Like we all learned how to say Barack Hussein Obama, right? We all remember his name because he was president and we had to figure out how to say it. Or when you think of, there's this great TED Talk, and it is an actress named Uzo. She was in Orange is the New Black. And she said when she was little, her name is Uzo Amaka. And it has great meaning from, I think she's from Nigeria. And she said when she was little, she was like, well, couldn't my name be Catherine? Like she like went to her mom and asked for her name to be something else. And her mom was like, if they can learn how to say Tchaikovsky and Mozart and Beethoven properly, right, they can learn how to say Uzo Amaka. And it was, I think it's just this idea that we are not bad with names. We are unwilling to put forth effort if we don't see the person as important. And they feel that, right? They feel that we don't think that they're important. And so in that story that Mark shared, it is such a acknowledgement to this person that although they're providing a service, although they might never see each other again, that Mark valued his service and valued him as a person who was providing that service, right? Yeah. And you saw in the taxi driver's reaction how rare that was and how important that was. Now, when I think about psychological safety is essentially the sense that you can trust the people you work for, right? That you could make a mistake, or you could make a misstep, or you could say something that they don't necessarily agree with, and you wouldn't experience retribution for that, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think names are probably the best first step. But then it is also the idea that leaders might say, I really crave feedback. I always want your feedback. But then what you witness is when you give feedback, they don't take that feedback, or they have an explanation for why you're wrong about the feedback, right? Mm-hmm. It is that, people, you can say one thing, but people see what you actually do, right? You can say you value people, but then you can't be bothered to pronounce people's names properly. Right. You can say that you want feedback, but you don't take any of that feedback. You can say you have an open door policy, but when people come in, you sort of are efficient with them and shoo them away. And so I think psychological safety from a leadership standpoint and how you really build that is through really slowing down to think about how you are, not just what you're saying, but how are you behaving in a way that reinforces the things you're saying.
And you mentioned the open door policy, and there were many things, but one thing that was really caused me to put the book down and I was really whoa, was the statement about the open door policy. You have to, and it was something along the lines of, I have it written down here, you have to be receptive to what walks through it. And that just really, that stuck with me. And you said it, because how many of us have walked through the door and been dismissed or been shushed, so to speak, in sharing some feedback or whatever the case may be. And so for some reason that in the book just really stood out to me. And I had to kind of sit it down and be whoa, that was pretty powerful.
Yeah, I think, an open door is not a policy. It's just an open door. And particularly going back to something you brought up earlier, if someone has had a negative experience with you, they are never going to walk through that door.
Yeah.
Right? If they've already felt marginalized in some way, either by you or someone else in the organization, they just won't ever walk through it because they've sort of learned behavior, fool me once, right? Right. We're going to do that again.
Right. So let me ask this. So let's say we have a leader who maybe had exhibited some of those traits before, and maybe they've read the book or maybe they've had some sort of epiphany, so to speak, to where they really want to make a shift in the behavior that they model. What does that look like in terms of building the trust of your team when they've already seen previous behavior from you that says otherwise?
I mean, vulnerability is not just a feeling. It is something that needs to be vocalized. So I think a lot of leaders, we saw this from a lot of leaders this summer, right? That murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, the subsequent protests around racial injustice, and all of the voices of Black people that were amplified that had not previously been so, we saw a lot of leaders say, I really wanted to believe that racism was a thing of the past, and that there were small groups of like KKK members who might still hold those beliefs, but that generally there was not like inherent racism existing in society, and certainly not like widespread. And you had leaders who for the first time were interested in, depending on their industry, like looking at, I worked with an executive team in the Southeastern US, predominantly white with a couple Black members of the team and predominantly male. And they had done a lot of research and were finally sort of willing to embrace the history of financial institutions, and that Black people were left out of financial institutions. They were not allowed to formally bank, right? They were not given credit or loans. And they were sort of hustled by and taken advantage of by some predatory institutions as a result of the fact that there wasn't like broad access to financing for them. And so they have a natural distrust of the bank. And what does that mean for how you service those customers and how you proactively, build trust and invest in those communities and look at whether people are credit worthy or not, right? As we look at sort of small business loans and that kind of thing. And so I think that there was, in that same sort of session, one of the leaders shared that he manages salespeople. Mm-hmm. And he, for the first time, realized that when some of his Black salespeople would go to some businesses, they'd have like success over the phone. But when they showed up in person and it was clear that they were Black, they were shut down or they were dismissed. And so he thought about, how am I joining sales calls, right? Like he joins, 10 or so sales calls a quarter. And how does he balance the sales calls he joins to try to mitigate some of that experience, to really bolster the credibility of his Black salespeople so that they can also hit their numbers, right? Because this was a thing he didn't really understand was happening before. He didn't take seriously or didn't ask questions about before. And he was very open with his team about this realization. And so I think that if you have a mindset shift as a leader, no one knows about it unless you talk about it, right? And you have to sort of like air that dirty laundry and say, this is how I used to see this, and this is how I see it now. And I want you as my team to hold me accountable because it's a process and I'm still sort of working through it. But being open about what they see and asking really critical questions about what it might be like to experience the world as a woman or as a queer person or as an immigrant or as a person of color, I think is really, really important. And all of that requires like vocalization. You have to say it. It can't just live in your head or else people don't know what's happening.
So you have to have the courage to kind of piggyback on towards the end of the book. The end of the book talks a lot about courage. So you really have to have the courage. And I think there's an element of courage in being vulnerable. So you have to have the courage to be vulnerable and really the courage to want to make that change. And then on the flip side too, the book talks about how as an individual, like having the courage to speak up.
Yeah, I think, it takes courage to be vulnerable. It takes courage to speak up. It takes courage to share your experience being on the receiving end of bias. It takes courage to throw yourself in the fray of something that doesn't impact you directly, right? To be an ally and an advocate, and really a co-conspirator, if you will, on making change. All of that is hard, right? Because your brain is naturally wired to avoid risk. Uh-huh. And it is risky to do all of those things. It's risky to like your personal relationships in some cases. It's risky to your career and your professional aspirations. We spend so much time at work. We don't want that to be an uncomfortable experience. Right. And so the ability to act in the face of that fear and risk is incredibly courageous. And it's not that the fear and risk go away, right? It's not that like only people who don't feel fear can be courageous. It's that you're acting anyway, right? Regardless of the fear or risk at play. you are saying what is most important is that we make progress in this arena.
Get the words out. What small steps do you think business owners or organizations or even individuals within an organization can take on to be more inclusive? Or what small things can they change in their day-to-day habits or activities to start to be more inclusive and to think about these things?
So I think if you are a leader or a business owner, right, like you have some influence in terms of the initiatives that are happening in your organization, I think diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging is a matter of competence and confidence, right? Mm-hmm. And so like if you are in banking, if you sell something, if you run a retail store, right, you have invested time and energy in becoming an expert at the thing that you do, right? So you have competence in whatever that thing is, whatever skill set that you have. And it took some time to get there. Maybe it took some formal education. It certainly took on the job education. And now there's this expectation that leaders and business owners have competence in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, but you have to like invest time in building competence, right? And so I think it is really important to think about, if you have a budget to engage in some facilitation and training, I think that's really important. And it can be done under the guise of like team building, right? And just really building some awareness and basic language and sort of infrastructure for how you think about inclusion and bias and diversity. I think if you don't have budget, if you're a super small business and you just don't have budget to invest in that, there are ways that you can sort of build in education, right? Is it a book club? Is it something like Harvard's Project Implicit, where you all log in and you take these tests around implicit bias and then have a candid discussion about the results, right? Is it something like listening to TED Talks or podcast episodes together? But there has to be an education component, because you don't just like wake up one day with the skills to do this because it's important to society, right?
Right.
So I think that is really critical. And I think if you think of competence building as akin to learning a language, you sort of first learn the vocabulary and then you can string together simple sentences. But the way in which you actually build fluency in a language is through practicing and having conversation. And so that might be, the first 10 minutes of your weekly meeting, or if you have like a roll call or some sort of stand-up meeting, right? Like spending 5 minutes talking about one idea or something you read in the news or something that's occurred to you, right? As a result of all the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think that thinking about education and where you get information, how you expose yourself to new ideas is really critical. And then actually talking about those things with other people is really important. And the final thing I would say for leaders is really thinking about your network and what that network looks like. I mean, if you look at similarity and difference across your network, there are ways in which, we've all heard the phrase, like, we're more connected than ever with technology, but the research says that we're actually more insular than ever because the algorithms in our technology push things our way that we're going to agree with. And our personal networks are rather homogenous, at least across race. So thinking about your own network and what it looks like and where there might be opportunity for you to expose yourself to different people. And sometimes that is like actual people you meet. And sometimes you just live in a place where that's maybe not possible. And it's like social media communities. It's things like Humans of New York, right? That is a social media campaign with pictures and stories. And it's people you'd never meet, but it gives you, sort of opens your aperture for life, the kinds of life experiences that people can have, right? Or even TV, like the kinds of stories being told on media are so... there was a time when you watched TV and anyone who was part of a marginalized group wouldn't necessarily see themselves reflected. Like you hear people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s say like the Cosby Show was so important because it was the only Black family on TV, right? Mm-hmm. And now there's innumerable Black families on TV, and there's shows like Pose that highlight the experience of the trans community, right? Like, and I might not have a trans friend, but I could watch that show and better understand that experience. So I think even in our personal lives, looking at our network and the voices we listen to and the stories we expose ourselves to can be quite profound.
So it's almost like the algorithms and everything contribute to our own confirmation bias. Is that the right one I'm thinking of? Where it kind of it confirms really kind of what we believe and what we see and expose ourselves to.
Yeah. I mean, you see it like in political, like there's been some interesting stories about political headlines, right? Like if you're a liberal and you type into Google, like Kamala Harris is, right? Like you get all these great things. And if you're conservative and you type in Kamala Harris is, you get all these terrible things, right? And so the algorithm just reinforces your perspective. It makes you feel like that's actually like the facts and information instead of just what you believe.
I want to thank you for talking with me today. And Justin, I want to give you a shout out because you helped arrange this interview today. Justin is a local ATD New Mexico member. So thank you for arranging this. I, again, want to give a shout out to the book. It's The Leader's Guide to Unconscious Bias. This is what it looks like. I bought my copy on Amazon. You can find yours there as well. And I'm sure FranklinCovey's website as well. Where else can we get the book?
You can get the book you can reach out to Justin if you're local to New Mexico and he can help you with that. Yeah. And if you go to FranklinCovey.com, there's additional resources around our unconscious bias work and thought leadership. And you can also get the book at, your local independent bookseller, in addition to Amazon.
So thank you so much. I appreciate your time and I look forward to my own reflection and how I can be more inclusive in the work that I do and the organizations that I serve. And I really appreciate it. It was a great read. I really enjoyed it.
I'm thrilled to hear that, Kelly. I think the process of writing a book is rather insular, like it's you and the computer screen. And so every time I hear from someone that the book had impact on them, that the stories mattered, and impacted how you look at the world and how you think about your own decisions, it just is really a positive feeling. I can't find a better word for it, but it really is affirming. There it is. It's affirming of all the time I spent looking at my computer screen. So thanks so much for having me and for the work that you're doing in New Mexico.
Thank you. I appreciate it.